everyone. I have decided to start Q&A with LDM. And what inspired me to do this, first of all, was that some people have been sending me questions, which I absolutely love, because the best way for all of us to learn is to ask questions. And so one of the favorite parts of teaching for me is actually answering questions that other people have. And also, I noticed that people that I follow on YouTube periodically do Q&As with the people who follow them. So I thought, well, hey, why don't we do that? So I'm bringing to you guys 4 questions today about a whole myriad of things. They don't necessarily have anything to do with each other, but I think it would be fun for all of us to learn. Okay, so we're going to start with question number 1, which is about how we as humans delineate time. Okay, so somebody asked me, I keep seeing CE and BCE when I'm reading things that are historical. And she was asking what this was about. So if you are like her, which I am, and probably most of you are, you grew up delineating time as BC and AD. Okay, BC means before Christ, and AD stands for a Latin phrase which means in the year of our Lord. So when we created this dating system, okay, we were basing it on the life of Jesus. Okay, now we know that Jesus was born probably 4 to 6 BC and lived to about 30 to 33 AD, depending on where you put his birth. And this is how we've delineated time. So within the last 20 years, the powers that be have decided that we're going to stop calling it that, and we're going to call it BCE and CE. BCE is before Common Era, and CE is Common Era. So basically, we've taken Jesus out of the equation. Now, the dates will still be the same. We haven't moved that at all. So your dates will not be changing. However, the terminology we use is changing. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody is doing it, okay? There are still plenty of people who are using the old vernacular of BC and AD. I am one of those. One, it's habit, but also for me, it makes sense to delineate time by Jesus's life, because that's when everything changed for humanity. And so for me, it just makes sense, and that's what I'm going to do. But I do know that when I'm reading things, they will probably be using BCE and CE. This is not an issue that we need to have huge debates about and get into arguments with people. This is a dating system. However, I choose to use BC and AD, just that's my preference. Now, because I like to go down some rabbit trails, we're going to take one and talk about the BC or BCE time periods. Now, we have dated these time periods off of the Egyptian dynastic periods. Now, I'm going to explain that a little bit. When Jesus was on earth, we had a lot of writing, okay? And we have actually copies of this writing still today, right? But as you go further back in time, we have less and less and less. And so it gets harder to date things, right? Based on archaeological evidence, because it's just not there, okay? And we can get into another topic about carbon dating. That's for another day. But when it talks about the written record, we don't have a whole lot. But when we look at the Egyptian culture, they had hieroglyphics on everything. Pyramids, monuments, temples, right? It's everywhere, okay? And they survived. And so once we figured out how to read the hieroglyphics, we were kind of able to piece together timelines based on the dynasties, right? The Pharaoh had his son, and then his son had another son, and they lived this long, right? And we can kind of piece together this timeline. Now, that has been going on for a long time, okay? And we as humans thought that we had the entire timeline. Well, it turns out that we are discovering we don't. That there are actually missing pieces of this timeline, okay? And you're thinking, why am I talking about this? Well, I'm going to tell you. A lot of times when people come up and want to challenge the Bible and say that it's not historically accurate, okay, they will reference times, right? Well, if Ramses was the pharaoh during Moses, then blank, 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 right? This archaeological evidence doesn't support this happening at this time because of blank, 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 right? And the further back in history you go, the further back in the Bible you go, this becomes more and more of a debatable topic. However, when you add in these times that have been missing, we'll call them missing times, right? When they get added in, a lot of these biblical events start making a lot of sense in a historical timeline fashion. And it really is showing that, yes, the Bible is a good historical document, and yes, it is reliable. Now, that's an important conversation to have. So you might be asking, well, why don't they change the timeline? Because, right, this doesn't just affect the Bible, it also affects other timelines, because we have based our timing of ancient events off of the Egyptian record, okay? Because they went for a really long time, and they actually overlapped, right, into the time of Jesus. So we can actually very easily use their system to calculate stuff. Well, I don't have a full answer for you other than it would be a major overhaul. Not only would you have to change every textbook, every course, you would be literally rewriting all of history, and people aren't real keen to do that. So if you're interested in that piece of timing, I highly suggest you rent or purchase Patterns of Evidence Exodus. And it actually goes through a lot of this, and it does it in a way that makes sense. It's not real scientific in its verbiage, so you can follow it very easily. And they have graphics, and you also learn a ton about the actual Exodus. And one of my favorite pieces actually is about Joseph. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in kind of this ancient timeline issue, definitely check that out. But to the original question, BCE is before Common Era, CE is Common Era, and they are directly related to the terms BC and AD that you probably grew up with. And it hasn't changed. We've just taken Jesus out of the equation. Who wrote the book of Hebrews? Simple, right? Not so much. Let's dig into this. First, what do we know about the writer of the letter of Hebrews? Well, we know this person had in-depth knowledge of what we now call the Old Testament, okay? Quoting quite a bit the Old Testament scriptures, so they knew a lot. This wasn't somebody who just maybe heard them. This was somebody who studied them, who knew them. But not just the Old Testament. This person also knew all of the customs that Jewish people follow. They knew about the sacrificial system, the tabernacle requirements, the priesthood. They knew all of the extra scriptural things that the Pharisees would make people do, right? They knew about all the washings. I mean, this person was very, very much knowledgeable of the inner workings of not just the Jewish community, but the Jewish religious community, okay? And so they were very familiar with that. We would call them, you know, an insider, so to speak. But this person was also extremely fluent in Greek. And you might think that that's not really a big deal, but it really makes this person set apart from others, okay? So this is a time period where we see the Jewish people are under Roman rule, okay? Now, they're under Roman rule, but everybody speaks Greek. And this is kind of like English is today, right? So most places in the world, people at least have a rudimentary idea of English, right? And so a lot of the Jewish people during this time were the same way, that they knew Greek. And this was back from when the Greeks were in charge of the Jewish people instead of the Romans, right? It happened right before. This is a huge thing to really understand. The Greeks took the Hebrew writings and translated them into Greek. And this was a big deal because when it became a Greek document or set of documents, everybody could read it. And so at this point in time, right before the Romans, you see this explosion of people understanding the Hebrew scriptures, and that's because it was in Greek. Now, a Jewish person would still read them in Hebrew, okay? So the Greek people or the non-Jewish people were the ones reading it in Greek. Okay, and when the Romans took over, everybody's still speaking Greek. Okay, now that's what we're talking about here. But this person doesn't just know Greek like as a second language. This person really is nuanced in the language. So if you know somebody who has English as a second language, they could be very, very fluent. However, sometimes they may not get the joke, or there might be a word that has multiple meanings and they choose the wrong meaning, right? There's just little tiny nuances that come out every now and then. This person doesn't have that. In fact, this person uses those types of nuances and does it correctly. And so when theologians look at the writer of this book, they really see this person as a master of the Greek language in that respect. So they probably grew up with this language. They probably heard it and spoke it since they learned to speak, right? But at the same time, this person is hugely knowledgeable of Jewish custom and Jewish religion, right? So when we look at this person, we think they are likely somebody like a Pharisee, right? Who lived and breathed the scriptures and all the laws and all of the everything, right? Like Paul was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. That's what we're talking about. This person really understood it, okay? And that's all we know. We don't even know if it's a man or woman. We think it's a man, but a few people might put a woman in there, but we really just don't know. That's all we know. However, this person, just based on those three facts, actually is a very unique type of person, okay? And so this is why a lot of people will move to Paul as the author. So let's talk about arguments for Paul being the author. First, he wrote a ton in the New Testament. I mean, like, a lot. So it just kind of makes sense that he would have written this one too, right? Like, why not? And we look back to somebody like Clement, who is a church father. Church fathers are people who were very close to the time of Christ, and they were the theologians of their day. They were wrestling these issues and really forming a lot of the theology that we sometimes have today, a lot of theology that we have today. And so these were the first people to be doing that, and they wrote it down, so we have it. You know, and they would teach other people. So you have Clement, who's about 150 to 215 AD, and he believed it was Paul. And so he taught his people, who taught their people, who taught their people. So in that regard, tradition from the very earliest time that we can nail down has thought that it was Paul. Now, that is a lot of credence. I mean, people believe that Clement is a very reliable source. And so because of that, the idea that he thought it was Paul makes others think that it must be Paul. When we look at the message in Hebrews, it's very consistent with what we would expect Paul to say. Okay, so that consistency plus the early church fathers really kind of lends a lot of credence to the thought that Paul wrote this book. But it goes on from there. We see that Paul did actually write to the Hebrews. Okay, and we see this in 1 Peter. So we know that at some point, Paul did write to the Hebrews. Now, whether this letter is that letter, we don't know. Now, we also look at the fact that within Hebrews, there's a mention of Timothy. Okay, now Timothy was somebody who went on a missionary journey with Paul. He was somebody that Paul corresponded with. That's how we get the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy. That's the Timothy. Okay, and nobody else is really talking about Timothy. So just the fact that Timothy is mentioned in Hebrews makes a lot of people think that, okay, this has to be Paul, right? Who else would it be? So that is really where the Paul camp stands. Now, not everybody believes it's Paul, okay? Up until about the 1800s, pretty much everybody was like, yeah, it's Paul. But since then, there's been some increasing number of dissent, basically. Okay, so if it's not Paul, then we kind of have two camps of people. We have the camp that says, okay, if it's not Paul, then it's definitely somebody close to him, because they probably heard him preach and then wrote it down, right? Or they just knew a lot of what he thought and compiled this letter, right? And so they're like, so that would give us Luke, Barnabas, Apollos, Silvanus. Some people would even argue Timothy himself or Priscilla. So if you remember Priscilla and Aquila, that's the Priscilla we're talking about here. So those are candidates for those people who say, okay, it's not Paul, but it's definitely somebody who is hanging around Paul a lot. Okay? And then there's another camp of people who are like, no, I don't think it's even them. And this is why they're in their own camp here, is because they look at the fact that Hebrews has no salutation. And a salutation is the beginning of a letter, right? And every other time Paul writes, he's saying, blessings to you people, I'm so happy to be writing, or, I'm not so happy to be writing, peace be to you, blah, blah, blah. And then he gets into the meat of the letter. But in Hebrews, you just start with the meat. There's no lead up. It's just bam, right there. So that doesn't really fit Paul's writing style. And to them, even if it was a close person to Paul, they would have still included the salutation. So they're like, yeah, it's not it. Okay? They also look at the fact of the quotations of what we call the Old Testament. Now, the person who wrote Hebrews quotes from the Septuagint and not the Masoretic text. And basically what I'm saying when I say that is that the person who wrote Hebrews is referencing the Greek manuscripts, not the Hebrew manuscripts. And we know that Paul called himself a Pharisee of the Pharisees, right? And those are the people who knew everything about all religious life for the Jew. And they knew by heart all of the scriptures in Hebrew, okay? Not in Greek. And so their argument is that this person was using the Septuagint, the Greek manuscripts, so therefore it cannot be Paul, because Paul would have used the Hebrew manuscripts. And there's a lot of logic to that, okay? It just would have been natural for Paul to do that. So they'll say it wasn't Paul, and if it wasn't Paul, it couldn't have been a close associate, because they would have done what Paul would have done, ergo it would not have been the Septuagint, the Greek manuscripts. Now, their last kind of contention is that the author states that he was taught by an apostle. And we know from Paul that he really wasn't, that he got his revelations from God. And so that may seem kind of like not a big deal, but it kind of is. So when you think about being taught by an apostle, this would be that an apostle would have been kind of over you, right, until you reached a certain level. And when you look at Paul, not only does he say that he got his revelations from God, but he also kind of called out apostles. When you think about him and Peter and their little back and forth, this was not somebody who was being taught by an apostle. It was somebody who commanded almost an equal authority. And so they look at this and say, the author of Hebrews says he was taught by an apostle. It couldn't be Paul, okay? It couldn't have happened. And so that's their arguments against. So you kind of have three camps. The camp that likes Paul for the authorship, okay? And this camp can go all the way back to 150 AD, right? And then you have the camp that says, well, I don't think it's Paul, but it's probably somebody close to Paul who was writing something he said or writing about what he said. And then you've got the third camp that's like, no, it's just not consistent. And if it doesn't say who wrote it, then we're better off just leaving it as a question mark. Now, no matter where you come down on the issue, the thing we need to remember is what Walter Martin says. And I love this quote. Walter Martin stated, "The book of Hebrews was written by a Hebrew to other Hebrews, telling the Hebrews to stop acting like Hebrews." And that's what we need to know. And that's what's so important about this book. And no matter who wrote it, the words are just as applicable to us, are just as scriptural, are just as Holy Spirit led as they were if we did know who it was from. And so although it's really cool to debate this topic and to think about it and to have our own opinions, in the end, it doesn't change what the scripture is, which is God's infallible word. It says, what are the themes throughout the historical Old Testament books? Now, first, which books are the Old Testament historical books? It's basically Joshua to Esther, okay? And these are considered the historical books of the Old Testament. And they tell basically how Israel became a nation, okay? So you think they came out of the Exodus, right? The whole Exodus period. And Moses dies and he hands over the baton to Joshua. And that is when the historical books start, okay? This is when they go and they conquer nations. They settle Canaan. It's where they go from tribal authority of the people to judges, and then finally to prophets, and then to a monarchy, right? So all the way through that. It's about the time where the kingdom became divided, okay? Where Israel stopped being one nation and started being two, the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah. It's how they lost their sovereignty. It's how they were conquered and sent into exile. And it's the return to the promised land after that exile. Okay, so that is the chunk of historical Old Testament books. Now the question was, what are some recurring themes in those 12 books? And so I have 10, but don't fear, they're not complicated. Okay, number 1, God is sovereign. What he wills is going to happen. He has the final say in judgment, and we see this over and over again throughout all of the New Testament, but especially in the historical books. And we see that, he tells the people, usually through a prophet, that, okay guys, if you do this, this is going to happen. And they do it, and that happens every time. Every time. God is the final say in judgment. Secondly, God gives the opportunity to follow him. He never just judgmented out of the blue, okay? He literally gave them the opportunity to make it right. We see this over and over. Those that abide in his word are considered righteous. Those that don't are called to account every time. And we see that he gives his people, what he expects, right? Go in, conquer the nation, don't marry their wives. When they marry their wives, they get punished. It happens. Don't take their idols. When they start following those idols, they get punished. We see this over and over and over and over and over again in the historical books. Number 3, God puts people in all kinds of situations to bring glory to him. We see this a lot in the historical books. Esther, the fact that this Jewish girl was made the queen of Persia, and that she was able to confront the king without being called, which was illegal, majorly illegal, okay? She was able to do this. This whole scenario was just kind of crazy. It was an insane situation. David being chosen to be king. He was the youngest, the smallest. He was a shepherd, but he was chosen to be king. David with Goliath, right? Couldn't even wear the armor. Didn't even go out with a sword. Joshua and Jericho. I mean, who would have thought walking around a wall would make it fall down? Rahab. The fact that this pagan woman would help out these spies. Josiah being able to bring revival to a whole nation who had gone astray. Ruth and Boaz. Ruth was not even Jewish, yet she decided to stay with her mother-in-law who needed her. I mean, we could go on and on and on. The historical books really show that God can use any situation and that God can put you in any kind of situation. Gideon, I mean, I could just go on and on and on, guys. Historical books most definitely show that God, he can put you in any kind of situation. He will use any kind of situation. And a lot of times they're going to be situations that just kind of blow your mind when you think about it. So that's kind of one of my favorites. Number 4, God is willing to act with miraculous ways for those that follow him. And this does somewhat go hand in hand with number 3, right? We see that when people should be executed, they're not. We see that David can kill a giant with a tiny little rock, right? We see the thing with Gideon and then the fleece, and we just on and on and on. We see that God will work in miraculous ways. Number 5, God protects his people So we see that over and over again in the historical books as well, okay? So don't think that God is all about judgment. A lot of times we think, oh, Old Testament, God is so judgmental. Oh, it's all angry and wrathful. But he protects his people. And we see this over and over again. When they go to battle and he wins, you see, all over, especially with the battles where this happens. And you also see where God withdraws his protection. And so the idea that God protects and can withdraw it is also a theme there, although I didn't have that in my notes. So, number 6, God can use anyone, no matter their station in life, no matter their race, their ethnicity, no matter, just keep on going, ... right? He often uses the least likely to do great things. So when you think about this, Ruth, she was a foreigner. She was a different race and ethnicity, and most likely originally was probably a different religion. Yet she was used, right? First, to help out Naomi. Secondly, to marry Boaz. Oh, and by the way, she's in the line, the lineage of Jesus. Big deal, okay? You look at David. David was the youngest. You look at Esther. She was a woman, and she wasn't the right kind of woman because she was Jewish, okay? We see Josiah. He was very young. We look at Deborah. Deborah became a judge, and she was a woman, right? And that was kind of odd, not expected. Gideon was considered weak. I mean, we just go on and on and on. So when you look at things, even in the Old Testament, God didn't, he didn't exclude people because of race or life or ethnicity, whatever. It was about following him, okay? Just like it is today. And so he can use anybody. Rahab, we think, was most likely a prostitute, pretty loose woman, right? So she was used, right? All of these people. So God can use anyone, no matter their station, no matter their race, their ethnicity, their handicap, their whatever. He can use them. Number 7, God demands obedience, but is forgiving when repentant. And that is so important, right? David sinned a ton, okay? He had an affair with a married woman. He made sure that her husband died because he wanted to cover up the pregnancy, right? These are kind of bad things. But you know what? When Nathan the prophet confronted him, David repented. He mourned for his sin, and he repented, and God forgave him. In fact, God says that David was a man after his own heart. So legit, he forgives if you're repentant, okay? And we see this with the nation of Israel. They were constantly sinning, constantly doing what God asked them not to do. But when they came back to him in repentance, God would bless them. They would forgive them, and so on and so on. And that goes on throughout all the historical books. We see that a lot. That was 7. Number 8, God fulfills his promises and covenants. He does not forget. And we see this a lot. That kind of goes back into the Pentateuch a little bit, the first 5 books of the Bible, right? But we see the fulfillment of those promises in the historical books. Okay, so if you can think of the first 5 books, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. There's a lot of covenants and promises that are going on in there with Abraham to make his descendants great, right? They're going to have a nation, all these things. The historical books are where that gets fulfilled, okay? Now it gets fulfilled in other books too, but we really see it in the historical books when Israel actually becomes a nation, not just as a people, but also owning land and other things like that. So definitely we can see all throughout the 12 historical books that God fulfills his promises. Number 9, moral decline leads to judgment. And that kind of goes with some of the previous ones, right? We see over and over again that when the nation of Israel decided to rebel against God, they suffered the consequences of that every time. And usually when they were rebelling, it was a moral issue. They were taking wives of foreigners, or they were having relations that they shouldn't. I want to keep this clean in case we have kids on here. But yeah, we can consistently see that the moral decline led to judgment. Also, another one would have been bringing in false gods. Yeah, we worship you, God. Well, we're going to add a few more to the mantle, right? Those types of things. And that's that would lead to judgment. And the last one, number 10, is God is always faithful, even when we aren't. And we can see that, right? Again and again, his people, either as a whole or as individuals, fall short. Why do they fall short? We know in Romans, because all have fallen short of the glory of God. We've all sinned, right? And so we see that even when we are not faithful to him, even when the Israelites were not faithful to him, either collectively or as individuals, he's still faithful to us, and he was faithful to them. And we can see that in the 12 books of the Old Testament, the 12 historical books, is that God was faithful even when they aren't. And so I hope that helps you understand a little bit about what's going on in the 12 historical books of the Old Testament. And really, I hope it gives you hope, because we can see that God fulfills his promises, that yes, he is the last say in judgment, but he's willing to forgive, and he is always faithful to us. And he can use us no matter our station in life, no matter anything, race, ethnicity, handicap, whatever you want to put in there. It doesn't matter. God can use anybody, and he can put them in extraordinary situations or ordinary situations, but all of them will bring glory to him. Okay, our last question for our first episode of Q&A with LDM. And this question is, will there be animals in heaven? Now, you may think that this question is a pretty simple yes or no, but let me tell you, this question is actually more complicated than the other three combined. But we're going to dig into it a little bit, because to be really honest, nobody knows, but it's fun to think about, so why not? All right, so as I said, number 1, nobody really knows. God knows. The angels might know, but none of us do. And so if anybody's hardcore on one side or the other, just tell them you don't really know, because they don't. Okay, but we can think about it, ponder, and come to our own conclusions. First, we're going to have to make an assumption in order to think about this. And the first thing is that I am assuming the person who asked me this question is referring to the new heaven and new earth that is created later. So it's not going to be the immediate heaven that we are in when we die. We are immediately with Jesus, not that place. I'm assuming that what is meant is the eternal forever place of the new heaven and new earth that we talk about in Revelation and some places. So I'm going to go with that. We're talking about the new heaven and earth. Second, animals are not made in the image of God. They also most likely do not have souls. Now, this statement will actually divert into about 10 arguments of other related things. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? What does it mean to have a soul? Why would animals not have souls? Do they have half souls? I mean, it could go on. So we're talking about a lot of rabbit holes here, okay? But many rely on this to say that because they're not made in the image of God, and because they don't have a soul, they will not be in heaven. Now, my answer to that is angels also fit that description. So we do know that they'll be in heaven. So we can't really use that as an argument. But we will talk about that in my fourth point. So we're just going to leave that there for the moment, in that if you're thinking they're not made in the image of God and they do not have souls, therefore they can't be in heaven, it's not so cut and dry. Okay, the third point. When discussing the new heaven and the new earth, you can take that very literally, as I do, that God will literally be creating a literal new earth and a literal new heaven. Okay? Now, we could go on this big long theological debate, is that include the outer space, whatever, we're not going down there. But new heaven and new earth. Now, a new earth will likely include the perfected version of this old earth, which is where we are right now. So where we are now, even creation groans, right? We know that everything about the earth we are on now is suffering because of sin. That includes animals, the plants, the dirt, the rocks, us, right? All of it, the weather, all of it, okay? And so many think that this new earth, because will literally be like the perfected version, what God wanted it to be, what God intended it to be before we ruined it, right? Thanks, Adam and Eve, okay? And if that's the case, there were animals in the garden. So it would seem to be that, okay, there might very well be animals in heaven. So that's where we get to point number 4. And this is going to get a little deep. Okay. Many times when people ask if there are going to be animals in heaven, they really are asking, is my fabulous pet dog or pet cat or pet whatever going to be with me in heaven? Because I love them. And some people love them literally as extended family. And that's a good thing, okay? Loving your pet is absolutely a fantastic thing. Now the question is, will that specific pet be in heaven with them? Now, let's think through this. I do not advocate that your specific pet will be in heaven with you, like you set up house and your dog comes running in, right? My dog from my childhood, I do not advocate that he, as that dog, will be in heaven with me, remembering life with me, so to speak, right? No. Animals have the breath of life, just as humans do, okay? That's what makes them different from like a plant, right? Even though a plant is living, it's not the same kind of living as animals and humans, okay? Now, we know from scripture that humans were made in the likeness of God. Or I'm sorry, in the image of God, the image and likeness of God. Not animals, okay? Humans. So even though we have the breath of life, we breathe, we're not the same, okay? And humans are higher up on that hierarchy than animals because we have the likeness of God, the image of God. Now, theologians will debate a lot about what specifically does that mean to be made in the image of God, okay? And a lot of that boils down to this idea of souls, okay? So when we look at what is a soul, we know that a soul is part of who we are. The soul is what will go on for eternity, okay? Now, whether that's in heaven or hell, you know, it still is going to go on, okay? And that's the soul, okay? And when Jesus came, he came to save our soul, okay? He's not saving animals from hell, okay? So even if an animal does have a soul, it's a lesser soul than a human's soul, okay? Now, both humans and animals have emotion, have a certain amount of will, and have a mind. Now, I think we all know that humans and animals are at varying levels on that, right? A human has more will than an animal, has more of a mind than an animal, has more emotion than an animal. So there is definitely a clear delineation. And in my opinion, and the opinion of many, is that delineation is what separates us so that the humans will be in heaven and their soul will continue, and that animals either don't have a soul, or if they do, it's not an eternal soul. So because of this, I do not think that, you know, Baxter the dog is going to be in heaven with you. However, there is a very likely possibility that God will have animals in heaven. So this also can lead into a discussion of, well, will they talk? Will animals talk? Maybe they talked in the beginning. These are all fun things to think about, but what I want to make abundantly clear is that whatever God decides to do in this heaven, we're going to enjoy it and we're going to love it, and we're not going to have tears or sadness. We're not going to miss what we had here. And so even if Sparky is not in heaven, you are not going to have a sadness. You are not going to miss that, because God has promised that we won't have those kinds of emotions there. Now, that's a good thing, and we don't have to be upset about that. And we can look at this and say, you know, is it possible that animals will be there? Sure, it's possible, and how fun would that be? But even if they're not there, it's still going to be amazing, and we're not going to sit there and be like, well, I wish there were animals up here. We're not going to even do that, okay? So this is a good thing. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that in the end, it doesn't matter, because God's going to do what he wants, and we kind of don't have any say in that. And that's okay too, because God always has our best interests at heart. And he's literally creating this place for us to be filled with joy and to not have sorrow. And so when we get there, we're not going to be worried about whether our pet is in heaven with us or not. And so I just want to leave you with that. But my personal opinion, and it's just an opinion, is that we probably will have animals. They just won't be our pets that we have at home. So I hope that was intriguing for you, and I'd be interested to see what you think. Okay, so that was our first episode of Q&A with LDM. I am very interested to see what you think, and as always, please send me your questions. I will try to answer you when you send them to me, but we'll also likely include them in future episodes of Q&A with LDM. So please leave your comments and questions in the comment section, or you can message me privately through Facebook on Messenger. I look forward to hearing from you.